A rough week for the banking industry.
The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank.
The second biggest bank collapse in U.S. history.
Bank runs may seem like a thing of the past, evoking images of the 1930s because that kind of stuff just doesn't happen anymore. But it does, and it did last week with Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank, once the 15th largest U.S. bank, has now collapsed. The Silicon Valley Bank has been taken over by the Federal Deposit Insurance Company due to its failure, making it the largest bank failure in the past 15 years and the second largest in U.S. history. The failure has caused major shockwaves throughout the banking, crypto, and venture capital industries, and it very well may be the end of an era. SVB had assets worth $209 billion at the end of 2022 and was a major provider of services to approximately 50% of U.S. venture capital-backed startups. As a result, nearly 65,000 tech startups are now scrambling to protect their funds. In this video, we'll break down why Silicon Valley Bank failed, and make sure to stay around until the end as we'll take a look at which bank is next in line and if the whole financial system is at risk. So let's jump straight in. If you know anything about this channel, you're probably aware that I have a tendency to search for patterns and investigate the underlying reason behind events. I'm not much of a believer in mere chance, as there is always a causation or correlation to things. To understand why SVB failed and if there are other banks that will fail next, we need to go back to 2019. Back in 2019, SVB had $71 billion in assets and was operating smoothly. As a bank, its business model involved taking deposits from customers, lending out 90% of that money, and holding the remaining 10% in reserve. In doing so, banks maintain a reserve with the central bank and insure their customers' deposits. While banking regulations allow for some flexibility, they are not typically pushed to the extreme due to the fragility of the banking industry. So business was good for SVB in 2019. Then 2020 happened. We all know what happened, I don't have to explain it to you, but most people don't know what happened in the finance world in 2020. That's because the information was swallowed up in the COVID pandemic and no one was talking about it on the big stage. When the government announced lockdown measures, they also mandated that businesses, with the exception of essential ones, shut down. This meant that many people were unable to work and earn an income. To mitigate this, the government implemented various forms of liquidity injections, such as stimulus checks and PPP loans. Prior to the issuance of stimulus checks, other liquidity injections were made to prevent widespread panic in response to the lockdowns. As a result of these measures, the stock market saw a significant rise in 2020, largely due to the Federal Reserve printing more money than ever before. The amount of money printed in 2020 far exceeded what was printed during the financial crisis in 2008. In 2008, efforts were made to rescue the financial services industry. However, in 2020, the aim was to save all industries, resulting in an unprecedented distribution of massive amounts of free money, totaling trillions of dollars, much of which was off balance sheet. The reason for this was due to the fact that people were unable to work, unlike during the 2008 crisis, meaning that money couldn't be channeled into productive areas. As a result, the funds began to flow into less sensible ventures. Unfortunately, this led to significant inflation and high interest rates, which is currently putting pressure on many businesses. However, it's important to note that every dollar the Fed printed was transferred to recipients through banks. No cash was physically distributed, as all transactions were made through checks and deposits into bank accounts. This is an important point to bear in mind, as it will become relevant later on. It's also important to recognize that the stimulus checks distributed by the government during the pandemic were not loans. Essentially, the Federal Reserve released a significant amount of money that would not be recovered. Additionally, a considerable portion of the PPP loans were forgiven, further emphasizing the point of no return. The funds released by the Federal Reserve ultimately disappeared without any guarantee of return. It's worth noting that the responsibility of the Federal Reserve is not to the American people, rather it lies with ensuring economic and financial stability regardless of the cost. This responsibility is distinct from that of the government, which is responsible for the well-being of the country's citizens. Okay, so returning to our SVB story. In 2021, the massive money printing by the Federal Reserve led to an influx of cash in banks. Remember when I said that SVB had $71 billion in 2019? Well, in 2021, these assets had tripled to $211 billion, and there's a problem. Do you remember how I also said banks make money? Well, they gave out loans, and the problem was that the banks weren't giving out enough loans. Hence, they were sitting on a pile of cash. Now, this shouldn't have been a problem, as a bank, having cash is a good thing. However, there was a conflict of interest at play, as banks are businesses that must turn a profit for their investors. Typically, profits come from the interest earned on loans. However, in this case, the bank was unable to lend out enough money to match the surplus they had. To maximize profits, SVB made the decision to invest their excess cash into long-term government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. These government bonds have a maturity of 10 years, and the bank hoped to earn a profit by waiting until maturity. Unfortunately, they did not anticipate the potential for chaos to arise before the bonds matured. In early 2022, inflation began to emerge, but central banks and economists initially dismissed it as transitory. However, by the end of the year, the Fed and other central banks were in full fight mode against inflation, with the only weapon at their disposal being interest rate hikes. This hike had far-reaching consequences, affecting many investments and businesses and leaving many individuals financially exposed, including SVB. SVB's primary losses can be attributed to two primary factors: rising interest rates and a struggling tech market. The bank's precarious position was exacerbated by poor timing, as it had positioned itself in a way that left it vulnerable to market fluctuations just before interest rates began to rise. For instance, SVB's $21 billion bond portfolio had a yield of only 1.79% and a duration of 3.6 years, which put it at a considerable disadvantage compared to the current 3-year Treasury yield of 4.71%. As interest rates continued to climb over the last year, SVB was faced with a challenging decision. With the value of its bonds plummeting, the bank had to choose between writing out the remaining 3 years of its bond duration with a yield far below the current Treasury rate, or selling at a loss and repositioning its portfolio to maximize yield. SVB's investments to capture profits were met with losses, and with cash constraints on businesses, many of their customers withdrew more funds than anticipated to keep up with the high interest rate environments. And the lesson here is that banks should not be making bets, at least not with the depositors' money. Okay, so what about other banks and the financial system as a whole? Are there any other institutions at risk here? Well, in events such as these, we often see a domino effect. But before I go into that, I ask you to do me a favor. Like this video and consider subscribing to Profit Protection for more in-depth content on finance, investing, and geopolitics. So what about the broad financial system? SVB's deposit and asset mix differs significantly from those of the top 20 banks in the US, with some experts arguing that the bank's issues more closely resemble those of the savings and loan crisis rather than the global financial crisis. This can be attributed to factors such as poor interest rate risk and liquidity management. One problematic decision made by SVB was funding long-term fixed-rate assets with variable rate funding during a time of rising interest rates, particularly as these assets must be marked to market. The toxicity of this strategy is expected to have a ripple effect. However, while there is always some risk of contagion in the financial system, the situation with SVB does not appear to be on the same scale as the 2008 financial crisis. The problems at SVB seem to be largely confined to the bank itself, rather than being a symptom of larger issues throughout the financial system. It's important to note that some are drawing parallels between the current situation and the 2008 financial crisis that involved investment banks like Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns. However, it's crucial to distinguish that SVB and other affected banks are commercial banks that accept deposits, unlike the investment banks involved in the 2008 crisis. While commercial banks can fail and face risks, they cannot leverage themselves as much as investment banks did before the 2008 crisis. For instance, Lehman Brothers had a leverage ratio of 3,100% before its collapse. Nevertheless, commercial banks can still encounter significant issues, such as selling bonds at losses and recognizing losses from bad loans. We've seen some reports that other banks, such as First Republic Bank, the 14th largest U.S. bank, as being in trouble. First Republic shares fell more than 60% and were briefly halted for volatility. Western Alliance Bancorp's stock also fell 47%, and PacWest Bancorp fell more than 20%. There is a possibility that multiple banks may face various challenges simultaneously, including interest rate risks and losses on mortgage and consumer loans. If the economy worsens, these issues could compound, leading to more banks facing financial difficulties.